We're in verses 12 through 17 today. We're going to look at the believers. Believers have a new liberty. And so we're in verses 12 through 17. We're going to start with verses 12 and 13. We'll read those, and then we'll get into our study. Notice this, Romans chapter 6, starting in verse 12. Let not sin therefore reign. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey it in the lust thereof. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. Now, up to this point, Paul has been speaking of our identification with Christ, and he spoke of our identification in his death and his burial and his resurrection. And so we've been touching on the idea of being free from sin this whole time, all the way up to this point in Romans chapter 6. He's been hammering home, free from sin, free from sin, free from sin. Sin is not in control. And I speak of sin, I'm personifying it, obviously. But sin is not in control. Sin is not the boss. We are. Therefore, we're not to allow sin to reign over us. Let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal bodies. We have a determinate choice to make that we are going to serve righteousness and not serve sin. If you read Romans chapter 6, the contrast is between, we think and we talk like this. We talk like, well, you can either serve sin or you can serve God. But that's not really accurate. Why?
You can't serve two masters.
Right. I mean, we can either serve sin or serve God, but that's still not accurate. Why?
Can we always just serve God?
Huh?
Can we always just serve God only?
Okay, so I'm a believer. We're all believers. I'm a Christian. And I am supposed to be serving God. But how do I serve God? According to Romans chapter 6, maybe I should have given some context. According to Romans chapter 6, the contrast is between sin and righteousness. And so we speak in wide terms sometimes. We give generalized statements about a lot of things. But the idea here is that we are either going to serve sin or we are going to serve righteousness. That's the two things, right? That the two areas or two decisions that we're going to make. So how am I going to do one over the other? I mean, I don't want to serve sin. I want to serve righteousness. How? Because the verse clearly says, let not sin therefore reign. So apparently there's something that I can do to make sure that I don't let sin reign.
Walk in the Spirit.
Walk in the Spirit. See, that wasn't so hard. See, that was easy. See what he just did? Right answer, right off the cuff. There's lots of things you could say. You could say, well, walk in the Spirit. You could say, be filled with the Spirit or anything of that nature. Walk in the light. And that's how we avoid letting sin reign. Sin is not in control. Now, it says, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies. But then in verse 3, it says, neither, verse 13, neither what? What's the next word? Neither yield. Yield. When you think of the word yield, what do you think of?
Giving up.
Giving up.
Or giving in.
Giving in.
Think of the sign, yield.
Okay, so you got a sign yield there. And when you see the sign yield, what does that mean?
Let the other go first.
Let the other go first. But in this case, it's don't let the other go first. Right?
Yep.
Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God. The word yield in verse 12 comes from a Greek word, which is the present active imperative of a word that's paristemi. Okay, that's the word. There's two things about the word that I want you to recognize. First, the idea of yield is not the idea of slowing down. That's the way I drive. See a yield sign, I slow down. It's the idea of you not letting the other person go. You don't yield. You keep going. You keep flying straight through. The other guy has to stop. So we're not to yield to sin. So Luke chapter 1 verse 19. Here's a good example for you. And who wants that? Okay, go ahead. Did you find it?
Yes. Luke chapter 1, verse 19. And the angel answering said unto him, I am Gabriel, that stand in the presence of God, and am sent to speak unto thee, and to show thee these glad tidings.
All right. Can anyone guess which word this is?
What chapter verse?
Stand?
Yeah, it's the word stand. Is that is that underlined or something?
It's not.
It's not. Oh, praise God. You got it all on here. That's good. Okay, so Gabriel said that he stands in the presence of God. It's the same word. So the word yield is the idea of giving power or authority to another. All right? So Gabriel here is peristemi, in the presence of God. He is yielding to God. God has the power and has the authority. So the angel Gabriel God has placed him under, and he has placed himself under, the power and the authority of God. So when we yield to something, because remember the verse says don't yield, but if you do yield to something, what you're doing basically is giving whatever it is you yield to power and authority over your life. So let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies. Yield not to sin, but yield to righteousness. So I'm allowing righteousness to reign in my body or rule over me and not sin. So there's the idea of these verses. The second thing about this word is that it is an imperative form. What's an imperative?
Command.
It's a command. So let's go back and look at that again. What does it say? Go back to Romans chapter 6, verse 13 again. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God. So Paul's not throwing out there some good ideas, do this and you'll be happy. He is giving you a command. This is a command from God not to yield your member as an instrument of unrighteousness unto sin. Now imagine that you're driving down the road. You are in complete control. You can turn anywhere you want, anytime you want. You can stop if you want. You can speed up if you want, slow down. It's completely up to you which action you take. Off in the distance, you see a fork in the road. One fork has a sign that says, yield to sin. Now, whether you slow down or not is up to you. It's up to you. You are in the driver's seat. The other fork says, yield to righteousness. It's up to you. Which fork are you going to take? But you're going to take one. But the sign in the scripture for you and I is to yield to righteousness. In other words, let righteousness have authority over your life. Let righteousness rule and reign, not sin. And every one of us knows the power of yielding to sin far too often. Paul says, choose sin or choose God, but you can't choose both. You can't choose both. You cannot continue in sin that grace may abound. Remember going back to verse 1. Who wants to read verse 1 again?
In Luke?
No, in Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Yeah, read that again.
What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?
Remember that Paul is answering that question. He's answering the question. So the idea here is that you choose sin or choose God, but you cannot continue in sin that grace may abound. There he's answering the question. Look at verse 14. His answer couldn't be more thorough, but yet he's not done yet. Verse 14, for sin shall not have dominion over you. Now wait a minute. Verse 13, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies, right? That was verse 12, sorry. Now in 14, it says that sin shall not reign over you. What's going on here? Because in one verse, verses 12 and 13, it sounds like there's some action or attitude on my part that's required. But then in verse 14, it sounds like sin can't reign over me anyway. Who said that? What do you mean?
Well, one, it's imperative. The other is indicative, meaning it's a statement of fact. 14, it's saying sin shall not have dominion over you, and then it gives the reason why. But in verse 12, it's imperative, saying, let not sin therefore reign.
All right, so in verse 12 and 13, we have a command. And in verse 14, as he points out, it's indicative. That's not a command, it's just a statement of fact. And he gives us the reason for the statement. Look at the last half of the verse. For ye are not under the law, but under grace. Remember, he's answering verse 1, right? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. For how shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein, right? So we're not supposed to continue sinning. We are not supposed to continue walking in sin with the idea that grace is somehow going to abound. If we continue walking, in sin, there's going to be more grace. That's not the point that Paul's making here. So he's telling us pretty clearly that sin will not have dominion over us because we're not under the law. So what does that mean to be not under the law? What does it mean to be under the law? Let's do that instead. What does that mean to be under the law?
Condemned.
Okay, condemned by the law. Yes.
I think it's the mode in which God, or the tone of our lives, which God has chosen for us to be under law or under grace. For in Old Testament days under the law.
Okay, so if I were living under the law today, how would that affect me?
You'd be a slave to sin.
I hate it when somebody steals my thunder. Yeah, exactly. You would be a slave to sin. If you're living under the law, you can be nothing else but a slave to sin because there's no grace in your life. You don't get to mix and match. Okay, this is not... Yes, sir?
So grace is a power that enables us to not let iniquity reign over us.
Yes.
Okay.
Because you can't... how do I want to say this? You cannot be free from sin of yourself. But we're not of ourselves now, are we? We're saved. We have the indwelling of the Spirit of God. We are empowered from salvation. You have been empowered to live for God. You have been empowered to be free from sin. That's what Romans 6 is all about. Again and again and again. Free from sin, dead to sin. You can do it. Anybody here done it yet?
Not perfectly.
Yeah. Hence the reason for writing of an imperative, not to yield to sin. We need that. We have to have that. Look at verse 15. And I'm going to come back to 14 in just a moment. But 15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. So don't lose sight of where Paul is going with this discussion. I'm not under the law, but that doesn't give me a ticket to do what I want. Oh, I don't have to worry about the law, so I can go out and live however I want. That's not the idea. The idea of not being under the law means I'm not under the condemnation of the law. You still can't violate God's moral law. It doesn't matter if you think you're in this age of grace or you're living under grace. All that may be true. You still don't get to sin. So there was a time when we walked according to the lust of the flesh, when we were by nature, the children of wrath. As such, the law of God condemned us. We were under the law's judgment. But now, having been saved by grace and walking in grace, we are no longer under the law to condemnation, but under grace to righteousness, freedom from sin. As a result, we are literally commanded to yield to God because having been freed from the law, it is not appropriate that sin should ever be given power over us again. You're going back to serve an old master. Verse 15, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. So at this point, Paul is now anticipating a second question. Okay, since we are not under the law but under grace, why should we concern ourselves with rules or regulations? Why should we care about what is right and what is wrong? Logically, that makes sense. But logically, it's not. Paul gives a definitive answer. What is the answer? No. Don't even think that way. A person may think that they're free from the law to the point that they no longer need to be concerned about God's moral standards, but that is by far not the truth. And we're kidding ourselves to even think that way. Is it possible to abuse grace?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
How?
Well, like you just said, where I'm under grace, so... But then again, if you're using that mentality, like Paul's making the case here that grace is not like a ticket to sin. Grace is something that empowers you, that frees you from the dominion of sin. That's the grace he's trying to make us understand. not like a grace that just leaves us in our weak, like impotent state. So, I mean, if you think grace is like that, then you have a misconception of what grace is, I guess.
Can you sin in grace? Sure got quiet out there. Can you sin in grace?
Looks like it's sin in grace, but that doesn't make it right.
Titus chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Who wants those?
I got it.
You got it, okay.
For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world.
So verse 11, the context is the grace of God. Verse 12 says that this grace of God teaches us what? Denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. So the kind of Christian who says, well, I'm under grace, I don't need to worry about God's law, is fooling himself, because God's grace does not lead us to violate God's law. God's law is God's righteous standard. He says this is what's right, this is what's wrong. That's his law. This is right, this is wrong. This is sinful, this is wicked. And the grace of God teaches you how to live what is right and how to avoid what is wrong. It's never going to say, don't worry about right and wrong. You're under grace, just do what you want. There's a lot of Christians today that operate under that perception. It's sad, but it's true. And you can go to the base, for example, and I can find all kinds of Christians there that would much prefer just to give God just a little bit of time on Sunday morning at the chapel, make it nice and easy, because they're not going to hear hard preaching. I mean, I hate to say it bluntly, but that's the way it is. And they don't want it. They don't want challenge. They don't want somebody to tell them that something is right and something is wrong, and you got to do right. They don't want that. They want to be able to cruise through life on their own. I'm not saying that they're not saved, but I will say this: they're certainly not growing, and they're certainly not being used very, very effectively for the Lord, because it's hard for the Lord to use people that aren't willing to be used. So Paul gives a very direct no. And then he gives a reason for no by stating a rhetorical question in verse 16. Know ye not? Don't you know? There's a rhetorical question. I say that it's rhetorical, but at the same time I wonder just how rhetorical it actually is, because it seems as if a good portion of churchgoers never really get the meaning of the question. So here's the logical answer behind the no. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are, to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness? That's a pretty simple answer. The point is fair enough. Whoever you're serving, that's your master. Right? So who's my master? My wife is, of course. She raised her hand. Pointed her. Oh, yeah. Oh, God is. Oh, I thought you, yeah. No, God is. So who's my master? It's supposed to be God, right?
Right.
But often, we choose a different master. We would rather serve the world or our peers or money or what. Yeah. All this stuff that's not righteous, okay? We'd rather serve that. So he's giving us this rhetorical question. Don't you know? The point is actually fairly simple. We choose whether we will be the servants of sin or the servants of obedience. But since we have been set free, and since the Father expects that his children live free, we should not assume that there is ever a good reason to sin. I heard someone say it this way: yeah, you could choose sin or righteousness, but really there's no choice at all as a Christian. You don't have a choice. You're not given the choice to do wrong. You're only given the choice to do right. That's your choice. You can't do wrong, but that's not on God's list of choices, and you're supposed to choose from his list. Does everybody follow the logic? This gets us in a lot of trouble when we do that. We're expected by the Lord to choose a walk of sanctification and holiness. That's what's on his list. We're expected to be children of obedience. All the commands of the Bible, every one of the commands that God gives us assumes that you could disobey them, but that's not on God's list. God's plan for you is not A or B. God's plan for you is A. It's pretty simple. Should be easy to follow. The problem is we don't like to follow it. Look at verse 17. So, whichever you choose becomes a driving force, becomes your master in your life. And if sin becomes the master, then the road you walk is going to lead to death. But if obedience becomes your master, then the road you walk leads to righteousness. Verse 17. Josh, can you read that?
But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you.
If a Christian sins, does he lose his salvation?
No.
No.
No. So I made the statement earlier that if you choose sin as your master, that leads to death. The wages of sin is death. That is a universal guiding principle, Christian or lost alike. Okay, that's the guiding principle. The wages of sin is death. So in a Christian's life, I'm not going to lose my salvation. So what dies when I sin?
Well, your right standing and your joy and
Okay, fellowship with God is dead.
Mhm.
Joy is dead.
Yep.
Usefulness is dead.
Maybe God's blessing on your life.
God's blessings, dead. We can think of all these different things that die when we sin. Right? So, he gives us this verse in 17, but God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you. So verse 17 is a bit of a personal note here. Paul is implying that he knows something about the Roman believers' walk, and he believes that their walk is a walk of obedience. They'd received what Paul referred to as that form of doctrine, which had been delivered to them. What's he talking about, that form of doctrine? Crickets out there.
Sanctification.
Okay? He says, you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. What was delivered them that they obeyed that has freed them from sin?
The gospel.
The gospel. The truth. To keep it simple, that form of doctrine is just talking about biblical truth. And so what does he do? He thanks God for them. He thanks God they had not allowed themselves to become servants of sin after they were set free, but had begun a walk of obedience. And that obedience came straight from their heart. So, I want you to think back to the day you got saved. And how many of you were adults when you got saved? You're already adults, okay? 3, 4, any other 5? Okay, you were adults the day you got saved. On the day that you got saved, did you know everything about sin that you know now? No, you didn't? Okay, neither did I. That's not unusual. On the day that you got saved, did you stop all of the sins that you know about now? No? 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 No, I only knew 4, so I quit those 4.
so
I had a lot more to learn. Right? I quit those 4 day 1, those 4 were gone. Day 2, those 4 were still gone, but I was still sinning. I just didn't know it. That's when the learning curve began. And I started learning about what God wanted from me and what I was supposed to be doing as a Christian. And I got to tell you, it was rough. There was a lot of things wrong in me, and I didn't know it. Nobody does. And even if you got saved, how many of you got saved at, say, you were a teenager or younger? Right. So you might have known at the age of, how old were you when you got saved?
Like 18, 19.
18?
Yeah, right on the cusp.
Right on that edge. Am I an adult? Can I vote? Has car insurance gone down yet? Okay. Anybody younger than 18? How old were you when you got saved? How old? 16? Anybody younger than that? Yeah? How old were you? 12. Yeah. When you were 12 years old, did you know it was wrong to steal? When you were 12 years old, did you know that it was a sin to steal something? You knew that, right? Yeah? Okay. Was it wrong to kill? Yeah? Did you still lie? Yeah. Yeah. Some work to be done, but maybe you knew more than I did because you grew up in a Christian home and I didn't grow up in a Christian home. So you knew more. So there's a lot more that you were accountable to, but as we learn, as we grow, what happens? The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men, teaching us that teaching us. You learn and you grow. All right? So Paul is making a good point here. You begin a walk of obedience even though you don't know everything you're doing is wrong. What you know, you do. And you learn. Nobody got the perfection overnight thing, right? It's like I get saved and then all of a sudden I'm shining and my face is like Moses, and that didn't happen. That never happens, all right? Turn to Galatians chapter 3. The life of a believer is not a mechanical lifestyle. It's a desire to live as Christ wills us to live from the heart. And that's what draws such a distinction between a person with a moral lifestyle and a person who's really saved. All right? Galatians 3, 10 through 14. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. So far, in verses 10 and 11, we find the works of the law are under the curse. Cursed is everyone that continueth not in the things that are written in the book. And then verse 11, we learn that the law cannot justify us. Verse 12, and the law is not of faith. So now we learn we're cursed under the law. It can't justify us. It is not of faith. Get that point. But the man that doeth them shall live in them. In other words, a religious person will either try to live by a law or the law, or he will live by faith. You can't mix those two. Law and faith are like oil and water. Try as you might, you cannot get them to mix. All right? It cannot happen. Verse 12 again, and the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them, the law, shall live in them. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree, that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So the whole key is faith. In Romans 6 and verse 16, according to verse 16, there was a time when the Romans, and by extension every lost person, was a servant to sin. That's what we all were, bar none. It was a time of slavery. It was a time where you lacked purpose. Why would anyone want to return to that type of life? Right? In American history, we had the horrible period called slavery, and in that period of time, slaves ran away. They didn't go back. I don't know of any story where any slave said, you know what, this freedom stuff is for the birds, I'm going back. I'd rather be a slave. Nobody ever goes back to slavery, but for some reason, when we transfer that thought over to in the spiritual sense, we get stupid and decide to go back and put ourselves under the old master of sin again. And I have no clue why we do that, because we don't have to. There is no reason for us to do that. So according to verse 16, there was a time when they were slaves of sin, and we do that too. The sad thing is that's the character of man. Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. And let's see, who has not read yet? Let's pick on Let's pick on Cole back there. Cole, can you read that? Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6.
Numbers what?
11, verses 4 through 6.
And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again, and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this man before our eyes.
All right. Think of the slavery of the Jews in Egypt. What were they doing? What were the slaves in Egypt doing?
Making bricks.
Making bricks. Out of what?
Clay and straw.
Clay and straw. And then when they got the Egyptians a little more riled up, they even took away the straw. What happened if they didn't make enough bricks?
They got beat.
They got beat. They got punished. Do you suppose that the Jewish slaves ate as well as the Egyptians did?
No.
I wouldn't think so. You suppose that they lived in a nice house? No. Probably didn't drive a nice car either. In fact, they probably didn't have anything nice. They were slaves. They lived a slave's life. Chances are their bodies were, bruised up and scarred up and all of that other stuff that you would normally see in a slave's life. But when things got tough while they're out there serving God, when they're going through the wilderness, and all of a sudden God takes them away that they are not comfortable with or they don't like, what happens? The mixed multitude, and everyone's still talking about who they were, suffice it to say they were not dedicated believers, but the mixed multitude fell a lusting. And what did they remember? They wept and they said, who's going to give us flesh to eat? We remember the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlics. You know what? None of that would have appealed much to me. Cucumbers, I could take them or leave them. Melons, I'm allergic. Leeks and garlics and onions, you got to chop that up and cook it right in order for me to eat it. So that wouldn't have been much of a big deal to me. But what is it that they remember? Did they remember the whip? No. You say, what's that got to do with the Christian life? Isaac, let me tell you about this thing I did one time. Me and my buddies, we went down to Tampa, Florida, and then you tell a story glorifying sin as if that old life was better than the one you have now. And we ought not be doing that. That's what they were doing. It is the character of man to rejoice in that which is sinful. And you cannot stop doing that as a lost man at all. As a Christian, you can. You've been given the power to do that. So if you start doing that, don't blame God. And don't blame, it's my wicked flesh. Yeah, that's what Paul said. He said, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of the sin? I thank God through Jesus Christ my Lord. So we really have no excuse. We have no excuse. We're not little mechanical robots. God gave us the ability to choose right. You had no ability before, but now you do. So we'll stop here. We'll come back next week and look at believers have a new Lord. Any questions or comments before we close in prayer?
Yes, sir. We talked about in this lesson about, we're now under grace as opposed to law, right? Could you delineate for the believers here as far as whenever, like Moses found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and how it was incidental as opposed to just abroad, was it?
Okay. So in the Old Testament, believers were just as much under grace as we are now. The Old Testament believers were not saved by law. They were saved by faith. The very first mention of grace is in the life of Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. All right? And so, don't get the idea that, in the Old Testament they were saved by law. They were not. They were saved by faith. Even in, was it Malachi 2:4, I think. It says that the just shall live by faith. Okay? It's always been by faith. It's always been by grace. If you lived in the Old Testament days, however, you showed your walk of faith by obedience to the law, that which had been revealed. Remember that in the Old Testament, if you lived during the time of Moses, or let's just say Joshua, that'll make it a little easier to illustrate. If you lived during the time of Joshua, you had this much Bible. Okay? But if you were a child of God, if you were following God, believed in God by faith, you obeyed this much Bible. We today, we have the full and complete Bible. We have the death, the burial, the resurrection. We have the ascension. We have the indwelling of the Spirit of God. We have the empowerment of the Spirit of God to be able to do right. And we obey this much. Okay, does everybody get it? But there's really not any difference other than how much God has revealed to us. And so that's the only difference. Never get the idea that they were saved at any time by works. We couldn't do it in the garden when everything was perfect, and we certainly can't do it now. If at any time, if anybody ever could have been saved by works, then Jesus would never have come. If we could do it, we wouldn't need him. Isn't that right? Why would I need Jesus if I could save myself? But that's just not the way it works, right? Any other questions?
I believe that the law, Old Testament, the law, God gave Moses the law. I think that Moses the law very important.
Oh, yeah.
But New Testament said the law of is not faith.
Right.
Jesus said the law, believe the law, believe no good.
Okay, I understand. Let me try to explain. Let's take Willie here. The law says, thou shalt not kill, right? So, if I kill Willie, am I going to go to heaven or hell?
Well, it depends.
Come on, people, defend me here.
Alright, if I kill Willie, I break God's law, am I going to go to heaven or hell?
Hell, apart from Christ.
If I don't kill Willie, am I going to go to heaven or hell?
Hell.
Apart from Christ.
Without Christ, it doesn't matter. Alright? Yes, the law is important because I'm sure Willie's going to say, yo, Pastor, Old Testament says thou shalt not kill, right?
Right.
Yeah? I mean, I don't have thieves come over to my house. It's just common sense. I want a law. I need a law. The law is righteous and holy. The problem is not the law. The problem is us. But the thing about the law is that there is nothing in the law. There is nothing in the law that can save us.
There's no salvation in the law.
The only thing that can save us is...
Grace. Christ.
Thank you. You've been saying Christ, Christ, Christ. I was thinking to say Christ again, but then you throw a no in it. Yeah, Christ. That's all that can save us. And I'm saved when I place my faith in Christ's finished work. If I place my faith in the law is not of faith. I have to place my faith in Christ. Okay? Does that help? All right. Anyone else? Good. Let's close. And then we'll have our workers' meeting. Brother Kim in the back, close us in prayer.
Thank you, Lord.